Hello everybody, Dr. Stringer here again. We're on to Module 4 already, which is on crime mapping. I can't believe how the semester is already moving along here. So this module, you're going to see a lot of similarities between what we talked about last week, CompStat and crime mapping. These are two very important things, as I talked about last week, and that's why we're spending 2 whole weeks on it. So as you did your readings for this module, you probably have already drawn some of these comparisons. But hopefully, as we move forward, you'll be able to figure out a little bit more, and hopefully that will help you as you work on understanding the advent of technology and how technology has really advanced in recent years to allow crime mapping to be more widely used and more helpful for policing and preventing crime in general. So we're going to talk about the 2 articles that you were responsible for reading. Was the Weisberg and McEwen article here, and we're not going to talk about that one specifically, but we are going to talk about a lot of the content that is in there, as well as the Nobles article, Nobles, Fox, Kay, and Lazat. I'm sorry, I don't know Alan Lazat. Yes, so hopefully I pronounced that right. But that's a very interesting article because that article involves communities and campuses with students in crime and looking at the Clery Act, which you are all students, so you should be interested in that, and that's one of the reasons why I selected that article. So just to give you a little bit of the history, mapping started back in the 1800s, and actually before that, it just wasn't very useful and things, and so starting in France, mapping started about 1825 to 1827 when they were able to figure out that crimes actually were highly correlated with education. And the education level in an area, the higher it went up, the lower the crime rate was, and vice versa. So that was a very interesting thing that started on. And then in Belgium, they kind of extended those French models, and they found that there was a correlation between crime and transportation and education levels and ethnical and cultural variations as well. And so those areas with high transportation are obviously probably going to have higher levels of crime because there's going to be more people there. And so that's another thing that's important to look at that we'll talk about a little bit more later. What originally happened was people were starting to look at these mapping ideas, but there wasn't the technology to be able to do much with it. And so a lot of these things got abandoned for what we know as positivist criminology. And those of you that have taken criminology or criminological theory and things like that have probably heard of your social learning theories and self-control theories and things like that. Things that are a little bit more individual level based and based on why did this person commit a crime, why did this person not commit a crime, things like that, which don't really look at the places where they commit the crimes at, but more about the individual motivations for committing them or not committing the crimes. So these are different ideas or different levels of analysis than you would find with mapping. So American crime mapping, for those of you that don't know, comes from the foundation of Park and Burgess's urban ecology studies in 1925. Some of you are probably familiar with Sean McKay's work, which later became social disorganization theory for juvenile delinquency. And these are very important pieces when you're looking at crime mapping. And so some people would tell you that, crime occurs everywhere. There's really no way to say, oh, well, this place is safe from crime and this place is not. Crime, yes, it can occur everywhere, and there is a kernel of truth to that. But as we'll see with looking at this module, there are places that have a whole lot more crime than others. And so looking at the spatial dynamics of this becomes increasingly important. for policy, for policing, for things like that. When you're looking at trying to reduce crime and stuff, it certainly helps you to know where the crime is occurring. Um, and so, looking at Sean McKay's models, we'll look at a little bit more of this as we move on. Uh, but their main idea was to look at the study of geographical location and look at, okay, well, where are these crimes occurring at? Where are, I'm sorry, the juvenile delinquency. Since they're delinquents, we don't really call them criminals because they're, juveniles. But either way, I may use that interchangeably. I'm not going to have that anything like that on your test, so don't worry about that because we're talking about mapping and crime and not the differences between juveniles and adults. But anyway, so looking at this is kind of, I've tried to make this where you guys can see it. And so this is kind of based on this mapping idea, this concentric zone theory. And this comes from Park and Burgess's ideas there. And as you can see, the inner area there is what you would call the Central Business District. And their model is based on Chicago. And so that's where this started off in 1925 in Chicago. If you see this line here, this is actually the right side of this line is actually Lake Michigan. So there's not much going on over there. And so then as you see out from there, you'll notice that there are other areas. There are what is known as concentric zones. And I'm trying to flip through here and remember what each one was called. Yes, okay. So if you look at the Central Business District in the middle there, you would have outside of that, you would have what is known as a zone in transition. And then moving forward out from that, the zone 3, as you can see, is actually, let me see if I can get this pointer to work here. Is that showing up on you all's? Okay. Well, let's hope that it's working. So you have the Central Business District here. And then moving out from that, this would be the middle of Chicago. And then the zone in transition would be the next zone that comes out that's almost immediately outside of there. And then you would have the zone of you would have your workmen's homes, your blue collar workers. They would work probably or live probably in this area here. And then you would have your residential zone that was even surrounding that. This would be kind of your suburbs. And then outside of that area would be this whole probably a little bit more rural zone, which is be your commuter zone. And their idea was based upon Chicago, but you could probably apply this logic to Atlanta if you wanted to as well. Having central Atlanta, and then as you move further out into the suburbs, you'll see that these are called different areas. And we'll actually see as we look at the crime that the crime actually changes along with that. So, moving right along there, so if we add these labels in here, see there's our zone of transition, the zone of the workmen's homes, that helps you to be able to see it a little bit better, and then the residential zone, and then you have your commuter zone here. You can see these labels a little bit better than you can the ones that are actually drawn on there, I'm sure. So moving along then, what you would see is the crime, there seems to be some that's kind of out here a little bit. You see these little red dots, they represent crime. Then the more of the crime you add there, you see that it's almost all centralized in these middle areas, in these that central business district, zone 1, and that transitional area, zone 2. As you get out further into the working area, the blue collar workers where they live, and then into the suburbs and all out there, it's much more dispersed. So you can see here immediately with this first graph, and this is 1925, so it's pretty cool that they came up with this way back then, that the crime is pretty well centrally located. Now, yes, you can say that all these areas are not, you're not completely safe from having crime if you're out there, because that you see there are some little red dots that are occurring out there, but not nearly as much as you would have elsewhere. So, looking at the map of Chicago here too, you can see that there is actually looking at the central area. This is just another map that it does also cluster looking at this map as well. And this is a little bit later. I don't remember exactly which year this is off the top of my head, but you can see that as well. So, looking at other cities, so we want to know, well, does what we saw in Chicago apply to other cities? Just Chicago, or could it be other cities have the same issue? So here's another big city. Probably, it's not as big as Chicago. It's Richmond, back in my old stomping grounds, well, close to at least. You can see that down in the area of downtown Richmond, there's a lot darker of an area there. The crime is much higher, and then as you get further out into the suburbs, the crime rate gets much lower, especially out in this area here. So here's another map. Here's Cleveland, Ohio. And looking at Cleveland, you can see downtown Cleveland right here, and that's the darker areas with the much darker shaded areas with a lot higher crime rates, as you can see from the key there. And then as you get further out, these shades get a little bit lower crime and lower crime until you get further out into these areas that are much further out there, and then you'll see that the crime rate is much lower. Here's another map. There's looking at the area of Cincinnati, Ohio. And so what you have here is this line right here is actually the Ohio River. But looking at downtown Cincinnati, downtown has the highest crime rates. And then the further out you go, the less and less it is, except for this one little outlier over here is what we would call it. Oh, there's actually a couple in Cincinnati, so that's interesting. But then again, even with these smaller outliers, they're still not nearly the same rate as you have downtown in this area. So, looking at the ideas of Sheldon McKay's research, it really illustrates that there is clustering of crime, and that, this is something that occurs and is something that we should be looking into. So Sheldon McKay were working on this in 1942, and that's when they came out and said all this. But the problem is, in 1942, we did not have the technology to be able to do very much with that. And so this is a very interesting thing for this class, because nowadays we have ArcGIS, we have Geoda, we have all these other sorts of mapping tools where we can put crime into a map and see where it shows up. We can see where our enforcement is too, where we're arresting people, where our police are stationed, how many police officers we have per area and things like that, and see where we need to put our resources. Similar as what we talked about a little bit last week when we were talking about CompStat. Since we couldn't do any of that, like I said before, sociologists went to this positivist idea, and they tried to fill voids using the individual motivations of the offender, the social learning theories and the social bond theories and self-control and things like that we've already talked about, because they didn't have the ability to do this. Well, among other reasons, but for our purposes, they couldn't do this back then. So right now, we have a renewed focus on crime in place. We're looking a lot more into offender-based explanations and looking at prevention theories and seeing, well, these are kind of a little bit inadequate. We know that the crime is clustering, and none of these theories do anything to help us figure out how that's happening and how it's being made possible. So instead, we're looking at, the context of crime. Crime does not occur within a sociological vacuum. It occurs in some sort of social environment. Your routine activities theories would help you there. Your broken windows theory, I say theory with a quotation mark there. But anyway, these sorts of things are your type of theories that are going to help you to explain the things that you're going to come up with mapping in context. So your hotspots policing. I think I touched on this a little bit last week. When you're looking at spatial relationships between crime and context, it became clear, right, that they were clustered, that there was something going on in that center area of the city, in the downtown area, in the zone in transition, that was where the crime was occurring. And nobody could analyze these without the appropriate mapping technologies. And so nowadays, mapping is becoming a very popular thing to do. If you all are planning on going into policing and things like that, you might want to try to develop some skills in mapping. I don't think that we have any courses in the criminal justice department right now, but I do believe that the geography department has several ArcGIS, which is the program that you would use to look at these things. They do a lot with that and have classes on that. I've done some research with it, but currently we're not offering a class in it right now. So if you were interested in that, that would be something that you should probably look into, because if you have these skills, you become in very high demand for police departments and for other units of the government that are looking into mapping things and finding out where crime is actually occurring. So there is evidence, that there is crime concentration, right? And so, as I mentioned at the outset of our little lecture here, not all places are, created equal. Some places are going to have more crime, some places are going to have less crime. So that doesn't necessarily mean that some places are going to be completely absolved of crime altogether. But if you think about the idea of the crime rate when you look at downtown Atlanta compared to Kennesaw, if you were just to pull that data, you would find that in downtown Atlanta, there's a lot more crime going on than there is all the way out here in Kennesaw. Even though we're still kind of in that metro Atlanta area, we would be way out in that commuter zone, possibly even further than that out. Interestingly, though, when you think about Atlanta, you can have some places, particularly in South Atlanta, that might not be that far from the center, but the crime rate is still pretty high there. And so this concentric zones theory, it has some logic that you can apply to Atlanta, but you want to think about, not every place is going to be exactly the same. Some things are a little bit different, especially across cities. So there's literally a ton of evidence out there, and I just have, a couple of citations here to look at, looking at the crime concentration, showing that it varies across different places. And so David Weisberg in 2004 says that 45% of the streets in Seattle accounted for 50% of the crime in that city. I mean, you think about that, 4 to 5% of the streets. So that's really saying that there's 50% of the crime is in this really small area of the city. And then the rest of the city is got the other 50%, but that's dispersed amongst the whole rest of the city, which is a whole lot, a larger area. So I would not want to be living in those 4 or 5% of the streets in Seattle. Sherman et al. And colleagues, David, no, I'm sure, I can't remember his first name. Sherman in 1989 found that 5% of all locations generated an average of 24 calls for service, each year. So, looking at those 5%, showing that, this area of only 5% of the city makes up a huge proportion of the police calls for service for crime reports. You can actually apply this to not just looking at cities, but looking at schools too. And so Astor and colleagues found that 40% of the crime in schools occurred in the hallways, another 20% occurred in cafeterias, and the rest of it occurred in locker rooms and other things like that, but they didn't make up a substantial portion of it. One thing to think about is that they did find that the classrooms had the least amount of all. So classrooms were actually a pretty safe place to be. And so looking at these other studies, 18% of all nightclubs accounted for 64% of the violent incidents. 15% of businesses experienced 60% of all incidences. Retailers and manufacturers, have 11% have 71% of the incidents, or 10% of the businesses had 66% of all incidents. So very small areas, businesses, schools, nightclubs, whatever you look at, are having the vast majority of the crime. And so this is clearly illustrating that things are clustered. So John Eck, in 2007, he came up with the 80-20 rule for places, and it's very similar to the 80-20 rule that we talked about for people when we're talking about crime. I mean, he says that 20% of places account for 80% of the crime. And we pretty well illustrated that when we were looking at our Chicago findings, right? That was about 80% of the crime, maybe even a little bit more, was in that center zone there in Chicago. And you look at Hummel and Clark, they found something similar, saying that 75% of physical assaults in bars occurred at only 17% of the bars in that area. And 2/3 of the 45 bars that they look at had no criminal events. So it's just 1/3 of those that are even having some crime, and then most of the 75% of them are actually occurring only at a very small proportion of them, only 17% of them. That's pretty close to our 80-20 rule there. Farrell found that 2/3 or 2 to 3% of respondents reported 25 to 30% of all victimization. And then you can look at some others here. You've got 2% of respondents experience 40% of all crimes. I'm not going to get into all the details about all of these, but the key thing to think about is, there's a lot of evidence that shows that there is clustering. And so for our purposes, it's important to know the technology that is used to look at these sorts of things. So looking forward, does crime cluster in college campuses? We've been mostly talking about the clustering of spatial clustering across space, but there is actually some research that says that the time of day is important. So there is clustering across the time of day. So you're more likely to be victimized on campus late at night or in the early morning hours of the morning than you are in the middle of the day. Police officers talk about day shift is usually pretty uneventful and there's not that much that goes on, but then the night shift has a lot more things going on. So those are important things to think about. Robinson in 2007 also found that the majority of crime committed near student dorms and other high traffic areas. Again, we have that high traffic issue. If there's a lot of people going in and out, then there's going to be a lot more crime, just as a proximity or a proxy of having more people there. Another thing to think about too, since we're talking about the time of day, the time of the season of the year. So the time of the year actually matters a lot too, and crime tends to be clustered more in the summertime. There's different theories as to why that is. Kids are out of school, the weather's nicer, the days are longer, things like that. One of the old interesting things of spurious effects that we like to, classic example of spurious effects is, the correlation between violent crime and ice cream sales. Well, we know that ice cream isn't causing violent crime, but it just so happens that there's more crime that occurs in the summertime, and so that's when most people are buying ice cream too. So the two are correlated there. So looking at the Cleary Act, and we're getting a little bit into kind of the Nobles article that you all were going to be reading this week too. And so the Cleary disclosure, as I think I talked about last week, says that schools are supposed to disclose all the crime that occurs on their campus. As we're going to see when we look at the Nobles article, they only have to disclose the crime that's occurring on campus. And so that data can be a little bit misleading, as we're going to see. So, looking at Noble's and colleagues in 2012, they had two main research questions. They said that they wanted to spatially investigate the extent to which the Clery Act captures crime occurring on and around campus. And number two, they wanted to investigate and compare the factors related to arrests on campus and off campus for both college students and members of the surrounding community. Now, don't get too bogged down. I know this is an article with a lot of advanced statistical analysis, and don't get too bogged down on all of that stuff. I know that it might be a little bit challenging to understand some of that when they get to talking about some of these complex models and things like that. But I do want you all to try to get a feel for this. As you move out of here and you're going to go off and get jobs, you might end up needing to read some of this stuff, and it might be helpful for you. And so having some experience there is going to help you, especially if you end up doing crime mapping or something like that. You're going to want to look and see how other people are doing stuff so that you can best do it. So the data that they have here, they looked at 49,000 arrests between 2003 and 2007. And so they used this tool called ArcGIS, which I've already talked about, to analyze these data. So the results of this spatial analysis found that the majority of on-campus crime clustered in the northeast corner of campus. Now, the least dense area of crime occurs towards the center of campus. And so that seemed a little different than our concentric zone theory for looking at cities. But this is an interesting thing to think about when they actually found that the large concentration of the on-campus arrests occurred close to the football stadium and the residence halls. So that's what's over there in that northeast corner of the campus, as we'll see in our map here. As we can see here, this northeast corner has the most crime, and that's also where the football stadium and the dorms are. So that's an interesting thing to think about. And then while you have some crimes, and see, here's our main roads here, and you see our traffic flow, just like we saw before. You're going to see a lot of arrests along areas with high traffic. Another road goes across this way, and so you'll see those sorts of things like that. And this is mainly because police officers are oftentimes driving their cars. Not only that, other people are driving their cars. Not only that, pedestrians are often walking on the sidewalks along these main roads. And so these tend to be main sources of transportation from one way or the other, or one place to another, regardless of how you're getting there. So when we take a closer look at that map, we find that most of the people arrested on campus were considered non-students. A lot of the people were not students, but where were the students arrested at? Well, just off the campus boundaries, an area that had a large concentration of bars and fraternity and sorority houses and things like that, there was a lot of student arrests. So, interestingly, if we look at this, within 500 feet of the campus boundary, there was an additional 6,146 arrests. So if you're looking at, the overall sample. So we look at the overall sample up here, and we've got 49,000 arrests. Only 3.5% of those arrests occurred on campus. So that's only about 1,700 on-campus arrests. So the Clery Act reports about 1,500. So if you're looking at this, you might think, well, we're looking at the Clery Act, 1,500 arrests in 3 years. That's not too bad. Or was it 4 years, I think? 3, yeah, okay. So, but then if you looked at this, within 500 feet of the boundary, you've got another additional 6,000 arrests, which don't have to be reported by the Clery Act. And so that can be a little bit misleading, because we define these things based upon the boundaries, but then you got a lot of things that go on right outside of campus. especially when you look at the alcohol outlets like the bars and things like that. Most universities nowadays, now that just did not used to be the case, but it is now that most universities don't have a lot of bars that are on the actual campus. They are right outside of the campus. I don't know how they came up with those policies, but we also know through a variety of research avenues that alcohol outlets also tend to be related to crime. So when you have a lot of bars in an area, you have a lot of violent crime, you have a lot of alcohol-related crime, you have a lot of alcohol and violent crime, because when people have a lot of alcohol, they tend to get violent sometimes. And so it's coincidence, perhaps, that a lot of the bars tend to be located off campus. But that can lead to a lot of crime in the surrounding area. Especially, I know when I was at another university, we had a very urban campus where if you were right on campus, you were fine. But if you went a street or two over, there were gangs that were right over there that lived in these areas. And so you had to be really careful if you decided not to park on campus and then walk back to your car late at night. And there used to be a lot of late night robberies of students and things like that when they would be out at 2 a.m. and probably a little bit intoxicated, and then, you know, walking back to their off-campus housing when they didn't live on campus itself. So, you know, the universities do a very good job of making sure that the campus itself is safe, but the surrounding area might not quite be so. And so, here's the map of not just looking at that university that we were looking at, which, it doesn't tell you what that university is, but looking at this, those of you that have ever been to the University of Florida might be able to tell that this is Gainesville, Florida. And so looking at that area that we looked at before, we see that now we're not just taking this small section of the map where the university is, but looking at the whole thing. And now we see that outside of the border, there's actually a whole lot more crime that's going on that wasn't recorded, because Clery data only has to say what's inside the university boundaries. And so, you know, that was a key finding of that article that said, you know, there might not be that much crime inside the boundaries, but then, you know, you go just 500 feet from the border and there's a lot more going on. And so mapping enables us to be able to know that. By looking at the map, we can figure these sorts of things out, rather than having to take somebody's word for it. So, you know, this study highlighted the idea that the Clery Act has some definitional problems with counting its crimes, right? They can be a little bit misleading if you're only looking at crimes that are inside the university boundaries. So some people might argue that the Clery Act fails to meet its goal because it paints an incomplete picture of crime and the potential risk for victimization, because you might think that the campus is safe, and while as long as you stay within the borders of the campus, that might be true, but you cross the street and you go 500 feet from campus, which is not very far, and you could be in a whole different type of area with a lot higher risk of victimization. And so we use this geospatial analysis to be able to reveal these types of things and the crime that is directly adjacent to campus, which we would not otherwise know about. So the conclusions of this, so without looking at maps that visually inspect where crime is occurring and the density of crime, estimating the amount of crime in a particular area would be pretty difficult and perhaps even elusive. As we talked about when we started talking about this, how people were interested in crime, 100 years ago, but there just wasn't the technology for it. So findings such as the ones that we see in the Nobles paper would be impossible without the use of the maps and without the use of the technology. So the technology becomes very important. And so just finally, the policy implications of all of this. You need to have appropriate allocation of the community and the police resources. And one of the ways that you can do that is by mapping this crime and figuring out where it's occurring. I think we've already talked about targeted police patrols and hotspots policing, and how being able to map where this crime is occurring can effectively help the police to be able to reduce some of it. And this can all research has shown that these things can be effective. Not only that, the crime prevention efforts can create a lot of victim awareness, so that way people are aware that this is actually something that is an issue within 500 feet of the campus. And so if people aren't aware, then they might be under this false assumption that they're safe and they don't need to worry about walking around at 2 a.m. 500 feet from campus because they've read the Clery Act data or looked at the Clery Act data, but that's kind of a little bit misleading about the area surrounding the campus. And so that was just one example. Obviously, not all universities would have the same crime within 500 feet of the campus. However, it is something to look at, and it's something to think about as you move forward and thinking about technology and how it can help crime prevention as well as criminal justice efforts to deter people from committing crimes. As well as catch people when they do. The police, if they know that an area is particularly crime-ridden, they can be there. They can hopefully prevent people from committing crimes, but if they do commit them, they can be there to hopefully catch them. So that is all that I have to talk to you about for this module. But we will pick up next module soon, and I look forward to talking to you all about Module 5 next week. And with that, I will say have a good day, and please email me if you have any questions or comments. And with that, have a good one.